The late 70s were supposed to be the funeral of American muscle, Washington declared. War on horsepower. The EPA tightened the noose, and one by one, Detroit's legends fell, silent. But Pontiac wasn't ready to surrender. Hiding under the Firebird hood of the Trans Am was an engine so outrageous, so unapologetic, that it mocked the regulations written to kill it. This wasn't just a car, it was a middle finger on four wheels, a machine that proved the muscle era wasn't over. Not yet. The 1970s, war on horsepower. The 1970s changed everything for American car culture. What had been the golden age of muscle in the 60s, big blocks, drag racing, street dominance, suddenly hit a wall. Rising fuel prices, insurance premiums, and stricter federal emission standards from the newly formed Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, began suffocating Detroit's horsepower. Revolution. Engines that once made 400 to 500 horsepower were suddenly rated down or detuned. Compression ratios were lowered, catalytic converters added, carburetors strangled by. Emission controls. The muscle car era was being dismantled, piece by piece. By 1975, it looked like the glory days were over. The Mustang had shrunk into a shadow of its former self. Mopar legends like the Hemi Cuda were gone. Even the Corvette had lost its sting. Detroit wasn't building muscle cars anymore. It was building compromises, but Pontiac had other plans. Pontiac's rebellion, the birth of the Trans Am. When most of Detroit was folding under EPA restrictions, Pontiac refused to let the muscle era die. The division had already made waves with the GTO in the 60s, the very car many call the first true muscle car. But by the mid-1970s, Pontiac engineers realized that to keep the dream alive, they'd have to play a dangerous game, one that meant pushing limits without getting caught in the EPA's chokehold. The answer was the Trans Am, born in 1969 as the high-performance Firebird variant. The Trans Am grown into more than just a car. It became Pontiac's ultimate rebellion piece, a muscle machine disguised in compliance. The magic wasn't just in the looks, though those flaming, screaming chicken decals and shaker hoods screamed attitude. The real weapon was under the hood, Pontiac's 455 HO, and later the Super Duty 455 engines. These weren't ordinary V8s. They were overbuilt, underrated, and carefully engineered to bypass regulations. On paper, Pontiac rated them at modest numbers, low enough not to draw government ire, but they delivered serious punch. The 1973 to 74 Trans Am Super Duty 455, for example, was officially rated at 290 horsepower. In truth, it was making closer to 370 to 400 horsepower, a figure dangerously close to the muscle era's peak. Pontiac had found the loophole. Tell the EPA one thing, deliver the customers another. The Trans Am didn't just survive the horsepower. Crackdown. It laughed in its face. The Super Duty 455, the engine that shouldn't have existed. In 1973, when every other automaker was choking down horsepower, Pontiac unleashed a monster nobody expected. The Super Duty 455, SD 455. This wasn't just a bigger version of their old 455 V8. The SD 455 was practically a race engine that somehow slipped into a streetcar. Engineers gave it reinforced cylinder walls, forged rods, high-flow round port heads, and a specially tuned camshaft. The block itself was so overbuilt that it could handle serious modifications, making it a favorite among drag racers. Officially, Pontiac claimed the SD455 made 290 horsepower, but that number was a lie, a clever one. Independent tests revealed it was pushing 370 to 400 plus horsepower, more than enough to embarrass the EPA's rules and crush competitors still gasping for air under regulations. It was the kind of engine that shouldn't have existed in 1973. Insurance companies hated it. Regulators hated it. The EPA especially hated it, and yet it was legal. Pontiac had found a way to package race-level power in a street-legal car without technically breaking the rules. For enthusiasts, it was a miracle. At a time when Mustang the Sounds were struggling to crack 140, HP and Corvettes were shadows of their former selves. The Trans Am SD455 was a fire-breathing outlaw. It became a symbol, proof that the muscle car spirit could survive even in the darkest days. The SD455 was rare too. Only about 1,295 Super Duty Trans Ams were built across 1973 and 1974. That scarcity, combined with its rebellious power, turned it into a legend almost overnight. To own one wasn't just about driving a car, it was about joining Pontiac's rebellion. It was a statement. You can't kill American muscle. The EPA strikes back. Regulations tighten. The Super Duty 455 may have been Pontiac's masterstroke, but it didn't go unnoticed. The Environmental Protection Agency was already deep in its campaign against high compression, high displacement engines. Catalytic converters became mandatory. Unleaded fuel was phased in. Corporate average fuel economy, CAFE, standards pushed. Automakers to downsize or face heavy penalties. For Pontiac, the SD455 had been a gamble, a middle finger to the EPA. But regulators don't like being mocked. By 1975, the rules were so tight that the mighty Super Duty couldn't survive. High emission standards and the switch to unleaded gas strangled Pontiac's ability to keep the beast alive. The Trans Am itself survived, but not without scars. The 400 cubic inch V8 became the standard, with power ratings falling well below their early 70s glory. On paper, the muscle car era was dead, and yet Pontiac's engineers weren't done fighting. They continued to quietly build engines that performed better than their official numbers suggested. By underrating horsepower, tweaking compression, and fine-tuning carburation, they kept the Trans Am alive in ways that embarrassed stricter competitors. This balancing act, giving enthusiasts a thrill while technically meeting regulations, became Pontiac's signature. The Trans Am wasn't just a car anymore, it was a rebellion that refused to bow down. The proof? Even in the late 70s, when nearly every other muscle car disappeared, the Trans Am not only survived, it thrived. Sales climbed, boosted in no small part by pop culture. Because just as the EPA tried to silence muscle, Hollywood gave Pontiac the loudest microphone in the world. Smokey and the Bandit. The Trans Am becomes a legend. By the mid-1970s, Pontiac's Trans Am already had a reputation in the garages of gearheads. The Super Duty 455 had proven that Detroit still had fight left in it, but outside car shows and drag strips, the world was changing. Regulations were choking. Performance. Insurance rates had skyrocketed. Gas shortages had turned high. Horsepower V8s into endangered species. For many, the muscle car era felt like it had drawn its last breath, and then came 1977. Hollywood, almost by accident, handed the Trans Am immortality. The movie was Smokey and the Bandit, a low-budget chase comedy starring Burt Reynolds, Sally Field, and Jackie Gleason. But the real headliner never spoke. A line of dialogue. It was painted black, trimmed in gold, and wore the most flamboyant hood decal Detroit had ever dared to sell, the infamous Screaming Chicken. From the very first shot, the Trans Am stealing the show. It wasn't just a car, it was an attitude on wheels. On screen, it jumped bridges, slid across highways, and mocked every sheriff in sight with a roar of its exhaust. Burt Reynolds gave the Bandit his swagger, but the Trans Am giving him his wings. The car became the ultimate co-star, embodying rebellion, confidence, and freedom in a way no human actor could. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. By 1977, muscle cars had been neutered. A typical performance car barely pushed 150 horsepower. Enthusiasts were starved for excitement, and younger audiences had grown up hearing about the glory days of GTOs, Chargers, and Boss Mustangs, but rarely saw anything alive on the street that could live up to the myth. Then suddenly, on the big screen, here was a car that looked like a predator and moved like a hunted outlaw refusing to be caught, and people wanted one badly. Sales numbers tell the story better than any critic ever could. Pontiac sold just over 46,000 Trans Ams in 1976. In 1977, after Smokey and the Bandit hit theaters, that number more than doubled to over 117,000. For a car that regulators had practically written off, it was nothing short of a resurrection. Kids tore out posters from magazines, dealers struggled to keep stock, and suddenly the Trans Am was no longer just a Pontiac coupe. It was the car to have, a badge of cool, a ticket to outlaw status, a rolling fantasy. Ironically, the Bandit's on-screen hero car wasn't even the most powerful Trans Am available. Beneath its gold-flamed hood sat a 6.6-liter V8 that made a modest 200 horsepower, hardly enough to back up its cinematic stunts. But that didn't matter. What Pontiac sold wasn't just horsepower, it was a feeling. The low rumble, the T-tops off on a summer night, the sight of that giant golden bird glinting in the sunlight, it all created an experience number alone couldn't measure. In an age when automakers were forced to bow to the EPA's rulebook, Pontiac gave buyers something no regulation could outlaw: attitude. The Bandit Trans Am wasn't about lap times or dyno sheets. It was about flipping a figurative middle finger to the idea that muscle cars were dead. It was about living fast, laughing loud, and daring anyone to tell you otherwise, and Hollywood made sure that message reached far beyond America's drag strips. Overseas, audiences who had never seen a Pontiac showroom suddenly knew exactly what a Trans Am was. The black and gold coupe became a cultural export, as iconic as Levi's jeans or Elvis Presley. More than 4 decades later, the Smokey and the Bandit Trans Am still stands as one of the most recognizable movie cars ever built. Collectors chase surviving Bandit editions, prices climb, and restoration shops specialize in recreating that exact black paint and gold trim. Enthusiasts who were kids in the 70s still remember the thrill of watching it soar across the big screen, and many eventually bought one to relive the dream. The Super Duty 455 had made the Trans Am a legend among performance fans, but Smokey and the Bandit made it something bigger, a legend of American pop culture. It was no longer just a car, it was a character, a statement, a promise that muscle wasn't gone, it had just been waiting for the right stage. The Bandit's Trans Am proved that sometimes all it takes is the right moment and the right story to turn metal and rubber into myth. And for the Pontiac Trans Am, that myth would outlast the decade, the regulations, and even Pontiac itself. Because once you've seen a Bandit Trans Am thunder across the screen, chased by sirens and dust, you understand this wasn't just Detroit steel. This was rebellion on 4 wheels, and no EPA regulation could ever silence that. Survival into the 80s and 90s. By the 1980s, the muscle car world looked like a ghost town. Mopar legends like the Cuda and Challenger were gone. Even Ford's Mustang had been reduced to a shadow of its late 60s glory. Only 2 names kept the muscle spirit alive: the Chevy Camaro and its wilder cousin, the Pontiac Trans Am. The Trans Am adapted. Gone were the massive big blocks of the early 70s, but Pontiac found new ways to keep its outlaw alive. In 1982, the 3rd-generation Trans Am debuted. With a sleeker, aerodynamic shape, a car that looked built for the future, and almost immediately it landed another pop culture spotlight. This time it was Knight Rider. Millions tuned in to watch David Hasselhoff's talking, crime-fighting Trans Am, known as KITT. The car wasn't just cool, it was futuristic. proving the Trans could reinvent itself to match the times. Through the 80s, horsepower slowly crept back. Tuned port injection, turbo V6 experiments, and handling-focused suspension packages gave the Trans Am an edge that most competitors couldn't match. And by the late 80s, performance was rising again. The 90s brought the fourth-generation Trans Am, a sharper, more aggressive beast. With the arrival of GM's LS1 V8 in 1998, the Trans Am was back to offering genuine muscle. Over 300 horsepower, a 6-speed manual, and quarter-mile times that rivaled the golden era, Pontiac had proven the Trans Am wasn't just a relic. It was still a weapon, but what really made it special was its survival. The Trans Am had outlasted most of its rivals, carrying the muscle car flame through decades when almost everyone else had given up. For die-hard enthusiasts, that made it more than a car. It was a symbol of loyalty, a constant reminder that Pontiac refused to be silenced, no matter how strict the rules became. The final roar, the last Trans Am and its legacy. By the early 2000s, the writing was on the wall. Pontiac as a brand was struggling, and the Trans Am, despite its cult following, couldn't escape GM's financial storm. In 2002, the last official Trans Am rolled off the line, closing a chapter that had stretched across 4 decades. The final cars were anything but weak, with the LS1 V8 pumping out 325 horsepower, 6-speed manuals, and T-top roofs. The 2002 Trans Am was proof that Pontiac wasn't going quietly. It left the stage in the same spirit it had entered, loud, aggressive, and unapologetic. But the legacy didn't end there. Even after Pontiac as a brand was killed off in 2010, the Trans Am refused to die in the hearts of enthusiasts, aftermarket builders, and specialty companies like Trans Am Worldwide kept the flame alive, creating modern reinterpretations of the classic bandit car with Corvette underpinnings and 700-plus horsepower. More importantly, the legend of the Trans Am is tied forever to one of the boldest engines of the 1970s, the Super Duty 455. It proved that even at the EPA's most restrictive moment, muscle cars could still roar back. It wasn't just an engine, it was a statement. Today, original SD455 Trans Ams are some of the most valuable and sought-after classics, commanding six-figure prices at auctions. Collectors see them not only as rare machines, but as pieces of American defiance, cars that stood up to the government and refused to surrender. The Trans Am story is one of rebellion, survival, and legacy. While the Camaro, Mustang, and Challenger fought their own wars, the Trans Am carved out its own legend, one built not just on numbers but on attitude. Even though Pontiac is gone, every time a Trans Am fires up, you can hear the echo of that rebellion, the sound of an engine that once silenced the EPA, the engine that silenced the EPA. They said muscle cars were dead. They said the government had won. By the mid-1970s, horsepower was being strangled, one regulation at a time. The golden age of American performance was supposed to be over, choked by catalytic converters, neutered by unleaded fuel, buried under emissions paperwork, but the Pontiac Trans Am refused to. Read the obituary. The Super Duty 455 was never supposed to exist. On paper, it was tame, a 290 horsepower V8 that looked compliant enough to pass through the EPA's radar. It was one of the most radical street engines Detroit had ever built. It was a wink to gearheads, a nod that said, "Don't believe the brochure. This car is alive," and alive it was. When most cars of the era could barely crack 10 seconds to 60, the SD455 Trans Am roared past expectations. It was faster than it had any right to be, tougher than it had any reason to survive. More than just horsepower, it was proof that American engineers weren't ready to bow down. That's what made the Trans Am different. It wasn't just a machine, it was a rebellion. Wearing a screaming chicken decal, It became the outlaw of the muscle car world, a car that made you feel like rules were made to be broken. You didn't just drive a Trans Am. You carried Pontiac's middle finger to the system with you wherever you went, and the world noticed. Hollywood gave it immortality. Burt Reynolds turned it into a movie star, KITT, turned it into a futuristic icon, and generations of kids turned it into a poster car. At a time when the EPA was trying to silence Detroit, the Trans Am was louder than ever, roaring across screens, across highways, across American culture. Even as the decades rolled on and the engines changed, the spirit never did. Whether it was a Super Duty in the 70s, a Knight Rider car in the 80s, or an LS-powered monster in the 90s, the Trans Am never lost its identity. It was always the rebel cousin, less polished than the Corvette, less mainstream than the Mustang, but every bit as legendary. And when Pontiac shut its doors in 2010, enthusiasts didn't mourn quietly. They celebrated what the Trans Am stood for: defiance. That's why today, SD455 Trans Ams are worth small fortunes. Not just because they're rare, not just because they're powerful, but because they represent a moment in history when one company refused to be silenced. Think about that. In an era where even legends were tame, the Trans Am stood tall. It was never meant to be the fastest car in the world. It wasn't supposed to change history. And yet it did. Because it carried something more important than numbers. It carried attitude. So the next time you see a Trans Am, maybe a bandit-style black and gold cruising down the highway, or a restored Super Duty idling with that deep V8 rumble, don't just see a car. See a statement. See the engineers who refused to give up. See the enthusiasts who kept the flame alive. The Trans Am wasn't built to play by the rules. It was built to remind us that rules don't always win, and even today, decades later, you can still hear its roar. Not in horsepower charts, not in emissions data, but in the hearts of those who know what it meant. The Pontiac Trans Am may have been silenced on paper, but in reality, it silenced the EPA, and its legend will echo if there are open roads to conquer. If you enjoyed this incredible story, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more epic automotive adventures. Your support keeps these stories alive.